Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Angela Lim, medical doctor and co-founder of Clearhead, an innovative employee wellbeing platform. Clear the Air is a podcast covering those experiences in your life or questions you have that you feel too vulnerable to share with those around you, such as, why do I feel so lonely? And what can I do to feel happier? We get real and raw on these existential questions on mental health and well-being that's puzzled humans for millennia, sharing the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. Hormone fluctuations are a normal part of a woman's life, but for many, they can wreak havoc on our mood, cognition, and overall mental well-being. Despite the profound impact hormones can have on our psychological state, the conversation is often overlooked or even misunderstood in the workplace. In this episode, we're joined by Caroline Gurvich to explore the powerful connection between hormones and mental health across the lifespan. From PMS to menopause, Caroline will unpack how our biology affects our brain function, emotional regulation, and mental resilience. Caroline is a clinical neuropsychologist and associate professor of the Department of Psychiatry at Monash University. She is also the deputy director of her Centre Australia, head of the Cognition and Hormones Group, and chair of the Victorian College of Clinical Neuropsychologists. Caroline has over 120 publications that have contributed to a better understanding of cognition in mental health and mental illness. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Angela. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, to kick us off, Caroline, maybe you can share with us what made you go on this journey that you're on today. Why did you become a clinical neuropsychologist?
Yeah, good question. I probably started this journey, I think it was probably when I was in third year university. So I did a Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Science at university. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I had lots of different interests, and I had this amazing professor for neuropsychology in third year. And he just inspired all these discussions about kind of the philosophical aspects of neuroscience. So we talked about things like free will versus genetic determinism and where does consciousness sit in our brain, those kinds of discussions. And I was really kind of captivated by that whole notion of brain, behavior, cognition. So that sort of took me on the journey of neuropsychology. And I've moved around lots of different areas. I did my honours year in Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease. And we use eye movements as a research tool, which is kind of like a window into brain function. And then my doctoral studies was in a mixture of psychiatry and neurology, so schizophrenia, depression, and Parkinson's disease, and looking at negative symptoms. And then my research kind of organically moved into women's mental health. I was inspired by a professor who I work with now, and she kind of highlighted the importance of sex and gender in mental health. And then we started to look into hormones, and I realized how important they are for cognition and in our brains. And so that's kind of been my pathway, but it's sort of been organic, I guess. I've just followed my interests and passions and ended up doing this job that I really enjoy.
That's awesome. Maybe to kick us off, let's start with the basic. What are hormones and how do they affect our brain?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I guess when we think about our reproductive hormones, estrogen and progesterone and testosterone, we think about the reproductive functions that those hormones serve. But those hormones do a whole lot more than just regulating our reproductive functions. So they're, in a very simple way, like chemical messengers. They have actions in our body, but also in our brains, and in particular in brain areas that are really important for our thinking skills. So these hormones, there are receptors, so part of the brain that respond to changes in the levels of these hormones in the front part of our brain and in the part of our brain called the temporal lobe, which is really important for regulating emotions and for memory. And so scientifically, it kind of makes sense that if parts of our brain can respond to changes in hormones, and those same parts of the brain are involved in thinking skills and involved in regulating our mood, we could expect to see an influence of these hormones on, brain and behavior and thinking skills and mood. So most of the studies on the brain and hormones are mainly animal studies, but that's where we get a lot of our research findings from. That's where we learn about things, and we have more of an opportunity to dissect and look and learn and experiment. So that's where a lot of the basic evidence has come from.
Okay, so it sounds like with the hormones, they help our brain work, whether that's from memory function to thinking skills and how we are feeling on the day with our mood. So what does it look like when it goes wrong?
Yeah, so obviously everyone has hormones and everyone has hormone fluctuations, but not everyone has challenges with their memory or their emotions or mood at times of hormone change. So for some reason, which we don't exactly know, but we've got different ideas, if we're talking about females, some females are just more sensitive to hormone fluctuations. So that might be someone who is sensitive to hormone fluctuations across the menstrual cycle. So for a female, they have a menstrual cycle, so 28-day on average time frame where our hormones, estrogen, progesterone, fluctuate. And some people are really sensitive to this, and in particular in that premenstrual time. So in that time, our progesterone goes up, our estrogen drops, and some people are just sensitive to that hormone fluctuation, and they might experience negative mood symptoms, irritability, and we call this PMS, premenstrual syndrome, or some people it's more than PMS. It's what we call PMDD, or a premenstrual depression. So for some people, it's more than just feeling a bit irritable. They become really quite depressed for many menstrual cycles, and they're really sensitive to these hormone fluctuations. From studies that have actually looked at absolute hormone levels, there's no difference in the amount of hormone fluctuation. It's just that some people are really sensitive to the hormone fluctuation. And then, so that's the menstrual cycle. And then for some women who become pregnant and have babies, that's obviously a time of lots of hormone change. It's also a time of big life change, like, having a baby is huge. So there's lots of things that contribute to potential mood things, but one factor is the big hormone changes that happen across pregnancy and after pregnancy. And during breastfeeding, there's hormone changes. So again, some women experience mood changes, depression, anxiety, postnatal depression in that postnatal period. And one contributing factor is likely to be hormone changes. Then later in the lifespan for females, there's perimenopause and menopause. So just to kind of break that down. So perimenopause is the lead up to menopause, and menopause is defined as 12 months following someone's last period or last menstrual cycle. And so in that perimenopausal time frame, which can be sort of 4 to 10 years, it's quite a large chunk of time, our hormone levels are fluctuating. So particularly our estrogen is fluctuating a lot and gradually declining. And then in menopause and postmenopause, our estrogen levels are a lot lower than what they are in our reproductive life years. And so again, some people, thrive through this phase of their life, no symptoms at all, don't really even notice it. Some women have mild symptoms, and some women are, again, really sensitive to hormone changes, and they experience lots of symptoms. So they could be in terms of kind of our psychological symptoms, because we often think about the hot flushes and the night sweats. They get talked about, I think, probably more, and have kind of defined what menopause is. But for a lot of people, they're psychological symptoms. So it might be things like depression, anxiety, irritability, paranoid thinking, and it can be a bit on-off. So people can feel quite emotional and then feel fine again. So it's a bit different to a standard depression that some people might experience. And then the other symptom that a lot of women talk about is this brain fog. So feeling foggy in their thinking, maybe decision-making might be a bit challenging. They might have trouble retrieving words, that tip of the tongue phenomena, where you just know the word, but you can't get it out. So those sorts of cognitive symptoms are also really common across the menopause or perimenopause, menopause transition years. And again, they can be really mild and not such a problem, but for some women, they can be quite substantial, to the point where some women feel like they can't work in the same way that they used to be able to work. So they can have a really significant adverse impact. So, it's a spectrum in terms of how sensitive people are to hormones. And we think it's the same women generally, not always, but it's often the same women who have been sensitive to hormones throughout their life that might be sensitive again during perimenopause, but not always. Some people have had no mood symptoms, no sensitivity to hormones, and then for whatever reason at menopause, they might develop mood symptoms or brain fog.
And so you shared examples across the lifespan, all the way from when women are just having their monthly period to when they're going through menopause. Some of the symptoms that you've outlined, whether that's mood changes like depression and anxiety to cognitive impact like brain fog, are those the same symptoms that you would see in the other parts when, for example, as you said, when someone just has a baby or when it's just a normal monthly period? Is it are they looking out for the same things, or is it still quite different?
It's actually pretty similar. So one of the symptoms, different degrees of severity. So across the menstrual cycle, so before someone gets their periods, and a lot of women experience, a bit of irritability or a little bit of foggy thinking, and it's pretty mild. So it might be that, but perhaps worse at menopause, or perhaps the same or not. And then for PMDD, so for the premenstrual dysphoric disorder or premenstrual depression, which is the more severe end of the spectrum where it's really quite debilitating for people, it's defined by depression, but one of the symptoms of that is, or can be, you don't have to have all the symptoms, but one of them can be the changes in cognition, that kind of, it could be confusion, or it could be just not thinking clearly, or forgetfulness. So similar type of profile, I guess, to what you might see in that kind of brain fog that people talk about during perimenopause and menopause transition years. So yeah, similar.
And I assume when women take, for example, pills to regulate their menstrual cycle, sometimes that obviously with the extra hormones that is through the contraceptive pill, that might also potentially trigger some of these symptoms as well that they might not have if they were not on the contraceptive pill. Is that right?
So I think it can go both ways. So for women who aren't on the pill and then they start taking the pill, the leveling out of hormones and then the addition of synthetic hormones can actually help the women who are really sensitive to the fluctuations, because those natural fluctuations are replaced, and particularly if there's certain pill types that might be better for some women, and there's lots of different hormonal contraceptives and they've all got slightly different types of the synthetic form of progesterone, the progestins in them, and a lot of the estrogen components, pretty similar across the pills, but there are some differences. So I guess for women who experience symptoms without being on the pill can be helpful. But then for some women who don't experience symptoms and then they start taking the contraceptive pill, they might notice that their mood changes in a negative way. And sometimes people don't always make the connection. So they might start taking the pill and then a couple of months later start feeling depressed, and you try and work out what's going on in your life that might be making you not feel great. And it's not often at the forefront of people's mind that, hang on, hormones might be playing a role. So I think it's really important to know that hormones can play a role, adding them in or not. And for women just to be aware, I think it's really important, just so they can think about if they're not feeling great, what's going on, what hormones are they taking, or where are they in their cycle? If they're not taking hormones, is there a pattern to their mood symptoms that's not related to their life? Like, if it can be explained by external triggers, like external things happening in your life, that's probably what's the best explanation. But if there's not significant adverse things happening in your life, but your mood's changing, think about hormones. They may or may not be playing a role for people.
It sounds tough to be a woman. We have a good extensive breakdown of the life cycle of being a woman. Do men have something similar? Have you done any research on that?
Our research is focused on women's mental health, but men have more high levels of testosterone. Women have testosterone as well. Men also have estrogen, and testosterone in our brain, we call it aromatizers, like changes to a form of estrogen. So these hormones are in both in everyone, but to different levels. But in terms of the fluctuations that happen across a woman's life cycle, so females have a menstrual cycle, men don't. Men don't have menopause. There are different theories about andropause, but the gradual levels of testosterone do decline gradually over lifespan, but it's not the same. It's not like this sudden, it's not sudden either in menopause. It's fluctuating, but it's heightened compared to the gradual decline that's very slow and steady that you might see that happens for men. And men also don't experience, if a woman becomes pregnant, men don't have that experience, so they don't experience the hormone changes that come with that. So there is a difference between sexes in terms of our hormones, and but both sexes do have the same hormones but at different levels.
I guess along those lines, in some ways you could say in the long arc of human history, women being in the workforce is kind of new. And in that context, we might have a lot of managers that might tend to be men who might not, as you said, experience anywhere near the hormone fluctuation that a woman does. And we're also increasingly working longer. And so women that might previously not be going through menopause in the workplace are currently doing so. So what are things that we should know about in terms of how those hormone fluctuations can show up in how someone presents at work? And what are maybe misunderstood signs that we should be aware of as managers and colleagues?
Yeah, I think it is such a good point. It's something that's, I feel like, it's being spoken about a lot more now, which is great. And as you say, a century ago, women were much less likely to be working during menopause. It just didn't happen. So it is a relatively new concept that we're, and that's why the conversations are, I guess, happening as well. In terms of what people should probably know and consider is that there can be impacts of menopause on women. However, really importantly, while women might experience brain fog or mood changes, there are plenty of women who don't. And the women who do experience brain fog, depression, they're still able to do work really well and use great cognitive skills and perform really well at work. It doesn't mean that someone doesn't have the ability anymore. So that's a really important point. And I don't want to ever portray the idea that women should leave work because they've got brain fog. That's not the message, even though for some women they need help to be able to thrive and do their best. But I think also the stereotypical picture of the hot flush, which is one of the more common symptoms of menopause, isn't the only symptom. So I think just knowing that each person's journey, throughout life, but particularly during menopause, it's really individual and unique. So everyone's needs are going to be unique and individual. So allowing women to have space to modify whatever they need, excuse me, it might be, if there's someone who gets hot flushes, that they can, wear layers or have a fan available to them. If it's someone who is experiencing brain fog and it's harder to retain big chunks of information, to send an email rather than shout something out in the corridor so they're not holding it in their mind, to allow people to, or encourage people to, take notes so then things are written down, give people time to prioritize or flexibility that they might need to be able to do their best.
And do you feel that I think a really important point is to acknowledge, like you said, don't use this information session as a way to discriminate against women in the workforce. We're trying to remind people that for a lot of people that they can continue to do good work. But for some people where those changes happen, some level of accommodation and empathy is really helpful. When talking about sort of those changes, and you mentioned it earlier, is that the person can feel like they're just not working as well as they used to. And from an individual perspective, regardless of whether you have an understanding boss or not, it's really frustrating for you. You know what you were capable of, and now you seem to not be as capable as you used to be. How do you advise these women on how to navigate this sudden change for some people?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just some sort of validation, like to know that then it's not odd or weird. It's really common to experience brain fog during the menopause transition. So the community-based studies say about 60% of women, so more than half, are going to experience some extent of brain fog. If it's to the point that it's making your job, your relationships, your life challenging, then there are lots of practical things that you can do. So the big one is self-care. So trying to make sure that you're minimizing stress in your life. So stress at any point in your life has an adverse impact on cognition. So trying to minimize stress is a really good starting point, and that's going to be different for everyone, what everyone's kind of stress reduction things are. But I think we also need to think that for a lot of women, menopause now happens at a time in life where life is really often stressful and busy. So often women are at the peak of their career around the time of menopause. So the average age is 51. Perimenopause then goes through your 40s and to your early 50s. So often that's a time when people are at the peak of their career, maybe a young or teenage children, maybe elderly parents, managing a household. So life is busy and stressful and people are already stretched. So when you add a bit of brain fog, poor sleep, crappy mood on top of that, that can be really challenging for a lot of people. So looking after yourself is crucial to try and minimize the stress. So things like for stress reduction, things like exercise is really important. It's important for your body, for your mind, for your mental health, and to reduce stress. For some people, if you are able to practice mindfulness or meditation, that can be a really good technique as well. And then moving more to and making sure you eat well and sleep well as much as possible. They're also, so those lifestyle changes, and I think everyone knows about what's good lifestyle habits. So, exercise, sleep, eating well, not drinking alcohol or too much alcohol, not taking drugs, not smoking, like all of those lifestyle things that everyone knows are really, really important. And having time for self-care, connecting with friends is another one that has a lot of evidence now for the importance in terms of minimizing depression, improving your brain health and your cognitive health. So good excuse to make sure you prioritize catching up with friends. So all of those lifestyle factors are really important. But moving on to kind of really practical tips. One of the key areas that people talk about is what we call working memory. So how much you can kind of juggle in your head at any one time. And that is limited. It's got a capacity for everyone. But often when we're stretched, we're juggling a lot of stuff in our heads, and it's hard then to take new bits of information and hold on to those. And then we forget information because we're not really attending and taking it in. So we need to kind of clear the bench space in our working memory, create more working memory capacity. So that means you have to not be thinking, have a sort of mental shopping list or a mental to-do list. You need to write it down. You need to get it out of your head and free up your working memory. So you've got a physical list and you know it's there. And if you've got 10 things you have to get done during the week, use your calendar to allocate times that you're going to do those activities. So you're not sort of juggling in your head, okay, I've got to do that Tuesday, or by Wednesday, I've got to get these reports done, or whatever it is. Allocate time so you know it's going to happen and you know when it's going to happen. So use calendars, diaries, to-do lists, writing things down, whatever you can do to minimize how much you're juggling in your head is going to be really helpful. Taking a bit of time to plan. So plan your tasks for the day or your tasks for the week. So getting structure and routine, that can also be really helpful. Our brains like structure and routine, and we tend to work well with that. So for most people, so trying to have structure and routine can also be really helpful to reduce that cognitive load, so then we can use our brains effectively. And then when we're working really hard, do things like, break tasks down so they're not, if you feel like things are hugely overwhelming, which is often another thing that people talk about, break tasks down. So, write down all the steps that are needed to get through your work task, and then, just focus on one at a time, take breaks when you need them, and kind of be kind to yourself to get through the task. If you need help prioritizing, hopefully you're in a position where you can talk to someone senior to you or a colleague to help kind of prioritize or delegate, so you can do the best with the things that you can do, and then someone else can help out with the things that perhaps they can help out with within the workspace.
That's a really great list of things that one can do for oneself. Is there anything else you might want to recommend to managers or employers that are listening to our talk today about what they can do to support the employee?
Yeah. So again, I guess just acknowledging can be really helpful. If you see someone and they look like they're struggling, you can, ask them what, if they need support, how can you support your employees, and what might they need? Do they need a bit of flexibility? Do they need some help with structure? As I said earlier, emailing lists of things to do can be helpful. So just I guess being aware and having the conversation, and just knowing that everyone's needs are going to be different. So being able to feel comfortable to ask that person, hey, what do you need for the next week, or for this task, or for the next couple of months, and supporting that person so you can, as an employer, you can get the best out of them, but also that you're looking after your employees to make sure that they're, comfortable and thriving and doing a good job.
I think really great suggestion, but I could also again imagine, say, this older male manager having to then have this conversation with older female direct report, for example. It could be quite maybe confronting or awkward to even start that conversation of, are you having hormonal changes? Like, how do you advise from how to start the conversation, what to say so that they're not putting their foot in their mouth?
Yeah. I guess you don't want to necessarily assume that someone is. Like, there's lots of reasons people can be stressed and having challenges, and sometimes it might come off the wrong way. So I guess as long as there's, every workplace, if they're big enough to have policies in place about menopause and to have conversations happening or have professional development sessions, things like that. So then it's a conversation that just happens in the workplace, in the same way that if a female's pregnant and going on maternity leave, it's okay to check in and say, how are you doing? Do you need any accommodations, any supports? And it's just a conversation that's had, so we can make sure people are, safe and doing well and looked after and being able to perform their best. So the more conversations happen, the more it's kind of normalized, and it can be an open conversation. But an employer doesn't necessarily have to ask someone, are there hormone changes, to explain your behavior? But it could be just checking in. How are you going? How's everything, broader than work? How are you going in terms of your mental well-being? Is there anything we can do to support you? And then if the employee is comfortable to say, I've got these symptoms, or I'm going through menopause, whether they say that or not, it's kind of an individual choice. But I guess if it's just in the broader looking after your employees' well-being, I think that should be what the conversation is about. And then, hopefully people are comfortable to say, just checking in, how you're going, making sure your workload's okay, are there any supports you need, that kind of thing, would hopefully be, people would be comfortable enough to ask their employees that.
We've had a good discussion, obviously, of women going through perimenopause or menopause in the workplace. But the other big one that, I could think of where those hormone changes are happening is, women who are pregnant or maybe just coming back as a new mom and having to balance potentially stuff like postnatal depression, the tricky time of like a first kid while, being a working parent. You mentioned, for example, stuff like brain fog in the context of someone going through menopause, but we hear of stuff like baby brain. So are there any other additional considerations for women who are either pregnant or just had a new baby?
Yeah. So I think, again, there are big brain changes that happen during pregnancy, and in the literature, it's probably still a little bit debated as to what happens to cognition, but certainly there are a lot of people who experience a form of baby brain where it's kind of harder to concentrate or retrieve information. And again, lots of potential reasons why that might be happening. So in the reverse to menopause, I guess our estrogen levels go up quite a lot during pregnancy, as do other hormone levels. And there can also be sleep changes like there are in menopause, which can be a big driver of foggy thinking when sleep is poor. So yes, there can be cognitive changes in the pregnancy phase and postnatal. As we said, there's lots going on. So particularly for parents who are first-time parents, it's a massive life change, like having a child when you used to look after yourself and now you're completely responsible 24 hours a day for another human being. And that takes up a huge amount of your mind space as well, thinking about the well-being of a child. And you're often not sleeping in those early stages, or maybe that might last for years, where you have a child who wakes you, and so your sleep isn't as good, and that can have an impact on your cognition and your thinking skills. And then there's the hormone changes, so that drop in estrogen, cortisol peaks and drops, progesterone changes. There's changes with prolactin, with breastfeeding. So there's lots of hormone changes that happen pregnancy and postnatal time that have an impact on our brain. And there's neuroimaging studies that show that the brain actually changes during pregnancy. It's amazing. Like, some of the research shows that areas of our brain that are involved in what we call social cognition, like things like empathy and kind of caring skills that you need as a parent, those brain areas adapt during pregnancy. It's like our body brain is preparing ourselves for becoming a parent, which is, remarkable that the human brain can do that. But that can have an impact for people as well. So, yeah, lots of reasons why someone's cognition and their mood might change. And there are a percentage of people who experience postnatal depression, which is, can be really challenging for people. So for that subset, it's really important that they seek professional help. And same during menopause as well. It's, mild symptoms might be managed on your own or with supportive people. But if you have significant symptoms that are really having an impact, I always encourage people to seek help. There is help available there. Make sure you find a good GP or health practitioner who has a good understanding of either managing postnatal depression or managing menopause, and finding out what the different treatment options are. And, during menopause, if you're experiencing significant cognitive symptoms and depression, also speaking about different hormone therapies, like we spoke about the contraceptive pill earlier, speaking to a healthcare practitioner, GP, or if you see, a gynecologist, obstetrician, whoever you're speaking to and looking after you, make sure that you seek help if you're struggling, because there is help out there. So that's really important for people.
It's such a good reminder that people don't have to suffer silently alone, that there is extra help out there. And, good reminder that, Clearhead is an EAP provider. So there are workplaces now increasingly ensuring that you can get funded support, including funded support for a therapist that might specialize in menopause, or a therapist that might specialize in postnatal depression. So, we'll look out for those support available. And Clearhead has a list of therapists that can help with that. You sort of touched on this, Caroline, around hormone replacement therapy. So what is the role of hormone replacement therapy in the context of all the hormone changes that is happening in menopause?
Yeah, so basically it's replacing or adding back in the hormones that our body is naturally declining, so estrogen and progesterone. So that's what it is doing. And there are different types of estrogens and progesterones that can be added back in depending on whether women have an intact uterus, what type of menopause. So there's, some women who have a surgical menopause. If, for example, they've got high risk of ovarian cancer, they might have surgical menopause before the age of natural menopause. So there's different types of hormone therapy. And in terms of the research so far about how hormone therapy, or we call it menopausal hormone therapy or hormone HRT, how much it can help depression or how much it can help brain fog, anecdotally, it can have a huge beneficial impact. So there's a lot of women who talk about the benefits of estrogen and also adding even testosterone on cognition. However, in terms of research and clinical guidelines, there's not enough research to really have made a change to any clinical guidelines. So at the moment, the first-line treatment still, I think, is still antidepressants for depression during menopause. However, if you're someone who has not had a history of depression and it's very much related to hormones, it kind of makes intuitive sense that if hormones are causing this, then adding back hormones, stabilizing those levels is going to help it. And a lot of women anecdotally report that having hormone therapy has had such a beneficial impact on their mental health, on their brain fog, on their depression. But I feel like we really, really need a lot more research to explore that and to understand that, and for cognition to understand, when hormone therapy is helpful. There's really very little research in that perimenopausal time frame. And then, how long after menopause is it still helpful? We don't really know exactly how long the brain can respond to hormone therapy in a positive way. So we're still gathering evidence, and we still really desperately need more research. So we do a lot of that research at her centre where I work at Monash University, trying to better understand which hormone therapies might be helpful for which people, and how do they compare to antidepressants for mood changes during menopause. So again, I think for each individual out there to know that they should have that discussion with their healthcare provider about what's going to be most beneficial for them and their unique makeup and their own risk factors that they might have. But then also a bit more broader, we need, in the scientific world, we need more research to progress that field and to understand exactly how hormone therapy is helping and who it's helping, so we can move forward and help people.
I think that's both the beautiful and frustrating thing about the human body. It's so complex that whenever you answer one question, you have 3 more pop up that you now have to answer. Not everyone obviously can have access to HRT. You spoke about before around lifestyle changes, including, for example, nutrition. Is based on your research, is there supplements you recommend or diets that people need to go on? What have you learned from that side?
Yeah, in terms of cognition and menopause, which is the main area I work in, I would say there's not enough research on any of the supplements to say that anything stands out as having a beneficial impact on a big group level. For some individuals, they might take something and find that it really helps them, and they might want to, if you're taking supplements, definitely speak to your doctor, monitor how you're going for 12 weeks to see if there's a benefit or adverse effect. But overall, there's no supplements that stand out as having a really beneficial effect on cognition. In terms of diet, again, there's no particular diet other than the Mediterranean diet in terms of cognitive health. So the Mediterranean diet for sort of midlife males, females, is the one that I think stacks up the most, has the best evidence base for building cognitive health, building brain health, mental health, and for longevity as well. So for healthy aging, that's the diet that keeps stacking up as having the best evidence. So, and that diet is what people eat in Mediterranean countries. So lots of fresh fruits and vegetables and nuts and good oils and fish, and not huge amounts of meat, so smaller amounts of particularly red meat. So that diet is the one that I would recommend for people to follow, and it's not prescriptive in terms of what it looks like, so it's manageable as well.
What about other techniques? Like you spoke about how this can impact our cognition, our memory, our mood. Are there, for example, evidence-based techniques around mindfulness? Do those work, or any sort of psychological therapy that you would suggest that people also add to their toolkit?
Yes. So yes, there is evidence for a couple of things. So one is mindfulness and one is CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. So for mindfulness and meditation, the evidence, there's a little bit of evidence in the menopause space, but it's probably not at a gold standard level. And there is a lot of evidence in the broader literature about how mindfulness and meditation can help cognition, can help things like improve attention skills, improve brain health and longevity, and cognitive health in terms of good, healthy brain aging. So there is, and for mood as well. So mindfulness and meditation can be really helpful as also preventative type behaviors if you can get into a good practice. For someone who is in the really depressed state, it's really hard for that person to engage in mindfulness and feel the benefits. So I feel like sometimes you need medication to help lift your mood to a point where you can engage in certain things like mindfulness and meditation. And there are meditation apps that you can get and listen to that can be really helpful to guide you through meditation. But there's also mindfulness just in day-to-day life. So it might be that, rather than getting a cup of coffee or tea and thinking about 5 million things, you're just present in that moment and you're just taking the time and just being aware of what you're doing. And that is a form of mindfulness, being present and aware. So there is evidence for mindfulness and meditation on brain and on things like attention and memory, positive benefits. Then in terms of other psychological therapies, there's cognitive behavior therapy. So that's a psychological therapy, kind of talks about the links between our cognition, so the different thoughts that we have. So rather than cognition being like attention, memory, in terms of CBT, it's more the actual cognitions or thoughts that we're experiencing and how that is linked to behaviors, actions that we're performing, and how that's linked to our emotions, how we feel, and then how that feeds back into the thoughts that we have. And it's a cycle or a triangle that links those cognitions, behaviors, and emotions. And cognitive behavior therapy looks at trying to change our thoughts rather than kind of directing it perhaps at changing our emotions or changing our behaviors that might then have a flow-on effect to changing our emotions. So there is, again, evidence that CBT can be helpful in menopause. Interestingly, it's really helpful also for hot flashes, the experience of hot flashes. There's evidence to show that CBT is one of the treatments that can be really helpful for a whole range of menopause symptoms. So that's something that if people aren't taking hormone therapy, that they can seek out someone who does CBT as a psychological therapy. And then recently we also reviewed the literature on kind of brain training. So those sorts of things to see what helps cognition or thinking processes. And probably I would say the evidence for some types of brain training, like the ones that you might get apps for, it tends to show that people can get really good at the task that they're doing their brain training on. So if you're doing some sort of, attention-based task or visual attention-based task, you can get really good at that task. But it doesn't necessarily, the evidence shows it doesn't necessarily generalize. So you are still really good at that task because you're practicing it over and over, but it might not have a huge flow-on effect to other areas of thinking or other areas of your life. There is a little bit of research that shows that cognitive strategy training can be helpful for cognition during midlife and menopause. So that's when you're using broader strategies rather than practicing one particular task. So strategies are things like to improve memory. If you feel like your memory is failing you, you might learn memory techniques. So these are things like repeating information, visualizing information, chunking information, or using external compensatory tools. So things like calendars, using digital tools like alarms, reminders, as much as possible. And that can help memory performance. And also, while we're talking about enhancing memory performance, I think I touched on before, but a lot of people feel like their memory, particularly during menopause, they report, I've got such bad memory. I think I've got Alzheimer's. I think I've got dementia. So that a lot of people worry that that's what they're experiencing. But often during menopause, memory per se is intact. It's attention that fails. So rather than people learning something and then forgetting it, they don't learn information in the first place. So there's a lot going on for most people, as we talked about, during those menopausal years. And when you are trying to learn something new, and I kind of touched on this before, but if you get distracted, you don't really read that piece of information or listen completely to the conversation. That bit of information isn't getting encoded, and then you're never going to retrieve it later because you never learnt the information in the first place. So some of these broader cognitive strategy training techniques also help enhance your ability to focus and attend. So kind of getting rid of distractions, trying really hard to focus on what you're doing or be mindful, I guess. That can also have a flow-on effect to improving your memory because you are better at encoding, taking in information, So then later when you want to retrieve it, it's there, it's encoded, so it's easier to retrieve that. So coming back to your question, I guess, yes, the non-HRT, in addition to the lifestyle, that, mindfulness, meditation, CBT, and then using kind of broad strategies, they're probably the things that I think have the best evidence base for people during menopause for a whole range of symptoms.
I want to obviously close the loop on something that you mentioned earlier, which is a key part of managing the hormone changes is managing your stress. And a lot of these things that you've just described will help you manage your stress as well. And by managing your stress, you will also improve your ability to then pay attention and then improve your memory, because you're now encoding the information into your brain to remember. So these things often don't sit in silos. They kind of sort of feed into each other and have a synergistic effect. A question I have then is, we talked about how these hormone fluctuations cause all these bad things to happen with brain fog and depression. Do these hormone fluctuations provide positive things that we should be aware of, that we could maybe be grateful for?
In some ways, there are certain things that people celebrate in terms of menopause. So one, for someone who's had negative experiences with their periods throughout their life, they end. So that's a positive. Some people embrace menopause as kind of a life phase that it's kind of a change, and people embrace that as an opportunity to revisit, reflect on their life. And then often postmenopausal women also describe a different mindset where you just don't care as much about what other people think. And so that's a positive of menopause. So maybe the hormone fluctuations and decline in themselves might not be hugely beneficial, but the menopause process for some people can be a really positive experience, because it can be a time to, embrace you and think about you and prioritize yourself, which is important for us all to have that self-care. And so a lot of people see it as, in terms of our brain, it's a time of vulnerability, because we're losing the protective benefits of these hormones. So estrogen has these scientific protective elements. We call it neuroprotection in the brain, where it can help, build new neurons and protect our brain. And we're losing that. So that's not a positive in terms of brain function. However, so that's why it makes it a vulnerable time frame for our brains. However, a lot of people say it's also an opportunity to do what we can to build our cognitive brain health for healthy aging, and have it as a time point where we can reflect on what's our lifestyle look like, what can I do to maximize my brain health and my mental health and my cognitive health, and set myself up for good healthy aging, and reflect on what do I want for my life goals. So it can go, it's about, I guess, adjusting your thinking to put a positive spin on it, and think about how can you thrive and make this a positive transition, which is really hard if you're feeling depressed. So that's why you might need help to manage the depression before you can have that positive mindset.
So much of what we talked about is how our hormones affect the way our brains work. Is there any extra consideration in the context of neurodiverse individuals, like those with ADHD or autism, where their brain generally already works differently from the neurotypical brain? What are the extra considerations that you've learned in your research?
It's a research area that probably got into in the last couple of years. So looking at that neurodivergent. So for people who aren't familiar with that term, a lot of people are now, but some people aren't. So we talk about neurodiversity as just being all different brain types that happen in our population. And then the majority of people are what we call neurotypical. And then there are a smaller percentage of the population are what we call neurodivergent. So that is where people who have ADHD brain types or autistic brain types sit in that neurodivergent end. And they're just differences in how people regulate their attention, or how people have social communication, or regulate their interests or motivations. So neurodivergent people have different brain types, and as you said, and then there's actually been very little research on how hormones impact or interact, I guess, with neurodivergence. So I've got a PhD student who just published a systematic review looking at what do we know about females, hormones, and she was looking specifically at ADHD. There's like no studies in menopause at all. So she's doing her PhD looking at that. And then there's a few studies that look across the menstrual cycle. And what we see is that females with ADHD who are more likely to experience depression and anxiety, mood symptoms at any time point, are also more likely to be sensitive to hormones in that way. So across the menstrual cycle, they can experience an exacerbation of ADHD symptoms before they get their period, or increased depression and anxiety. So we also surveyed women and found that that's what women were telling us about their experiences. Again, little research across pregnancy. Some people say their ADHD symptoms can improve potentially during pregnancy, but perhaps be worse postnatal. And then menopause, women tell us, but there's, again, no empirical research, but women tell us that their ADHD symptoms get worse during perimenopause. There's actually really interesting from the survey that we did, a lot of women were sort of early postmenopausal years, but a lot of those women were only diagnosed with ADHD during perimenopause. So we think of ADHD, or it is a childhood condition, it's neurodevelopmental, and we often incorrectly assume that it's only something that children experience. And once you're over the age of 18, you're not going to have autism or ADHD, but that's not right. So for most people, while it is neurodevelopmental, it's a brain type that you're born with and you develop, it stays with you. That's your brain type for your life. And so both ADHD and autism present quite differently in females and often is unnoticed. And then during menopause, a lot of people are coming forward asking questions about their brain type and why they might be struggling. And there's a little bit of research that shows that both autistic and ADHD people are more likely to experience more menopause symptoms. So some sort of increased likelihood for hormone sensitivity, but also whether their ADHD symptoms become a bit more pronounced during menopause, and that's what encourages people to seek a diagnosis. Or sometimes it's because of age of menopause, they have children who are being recognised as having ADHD and it's hereditary, and so then people start to recognise traits in themselves and question a diagnosis, and so it often coincides with that. So that might be what prompts people to seek a diagnosis around those perimenopausal years. So I guess for neurodivergent people, I think the literature overall shows that people are more sensitive to shifts in hormones in terms of mood effects or menopause symptoms. And for autistic people as well, it can be that change. Like change isn't always something that's particularly comfortable. And so experiencing change, bodily change, can be more challenging. Sometimes neurodivergent people have less what we call interoception. So they're less aware of their bodily feelings and sensations. And so then they might be less aware of different changes that might be going on. So there can be lots of different considerations for neurodivergent individuals when we're talking about hormone changes. And again, neurodivergence is on a spectrum, hormone sensitivity is on a spectrum. So there can be different combinations. So it's, again, a really individual experience.
Another population that I can think of that might potentially be affected by sort of these hormone changes are individuals who maybe have long-standing mental health disorders like schizophrenia. What else have you learned in that population?
So, yeah, and schizophrenia is an interesting one because for female, there's this estrogen protection hypothesis about schizophrenia where the typical age of onset is sort of in the early 20s and slightly later for females. And the idea is that estrogen provides some sort of protection for and extends the years before people's symptoms become pronounced. But then there's another peak onset for females and menopause, which is when estrogen drops off. And so that's quite interesting, and it's led to this idea that estrogen might provide some sort of protection, like we're talking about the neuroprotective properties of estrogen in the brain for people with schizophrenia, which has led to other research that my mentor, Professor Jayashri Kulkarni, has led a lot of research looking at estrogen as a treatment for mental illness, severe mental illness, including schizophrenia, where it's generally as an adjunct. So on top of other medications that people are taking, they take hormones, estrogen, and it improves their symptoms. So it improves their symptoms of psychosis and mood and general well-being. So that's one factor. For people with depression, there's a bit of research that shows if you have a history of depression, then that's a risk factor for developing depression again during menopause. So it's, I guess, something to keep in mind if you're someone who has had a history of depression. It might be, again, a time of vulnerability. So you just might want to be aware and do what you can to build up your lifestyle factors to be as protective as possible, or seek help if you need it.
So many different considerations, and obviously often these things have to be quite personalized to you. So, maybe just as a way of closing off the questions that we've asked, someone listening to this might go, actually, I think I'm being impacted by hormones. I'm having some of the symptoms you've just shared. What's the first step you advise them to do? Is it to go see the GP? Is it to go do some tests? Like, what's the first step?
Yeah, I would say go and see your GP. But also, be aware. I have had people talk about times where they've been dismissed by, bringing up, I think this is menopause, and potentially you've gone to see a GP who that's not their area of specialty. And so if that is your experience and you've gone to seek help and then you're dismissed, it can feel awful, but have confidence in yourself and seek out another person. Or if, I think, did you say, Angela, that on Clearhead there's...
Yeah, therapists that you can get support on that specializes in these things. Yes.
Yeah. So I would say definitely seek help. Don't suffer. You don't have to suffer. There is so many options of different avenues that people can take to help, whether that's, hormone therapy or antidepressants, if that's indicated or needed, psychological therapy, lifestyle choices. There is help and solutions out there. So if anyone's feeling like it might be hormones, I think the very first step is, if you have had mood changes, questioning, is there a role of hormones for yourself? There might not be. It might be other factors, but asking that question is always a really good starting point. But then going to speak to a GP or healthcare professional about it would be the next thing you should do.
Yeah. Our body, as we were saying, is beautiful but complex, and it's often a multifactorial reason for why we feel the way that we do. And so it might be a combination of changing your diet to getting extra professional help to potentially medication. And it's not a one size fits all. It's just very much one that you have to kind of figure out for yourself, and including little proactive stuff like practicing mindfulness, keeping on top of your stress, putting in strategies to manage your workload and put structure. And hopefully also be in workplaces where people are understanding and supportive as well. What a journey, Caroline. So many questions we've answered. We love to end these conversations with one simple question, which is, what's your one wellbeing practice to stay mentally well?
I think I have to have a couple. I can't just have one.
Absolutely.
Mine would be, I love, and I encourage everyone to engage in exercise, and probably more importantly, that is family. Like, that always comes first. Like, good relationships is super important. And then, looking after yourself. So exercise, good eating, self-care, good book is always helpful as well to be able to switch off and lose yourself in a good book. So, yeah.
That's it for today's episode. If you want to learn more about how Clearhead can support your workplace, or you have a burning mental health question that you'd like us to explore on the podcast, check us out at myclearhead.com and drop us a message. Love our content? Share it with a friend, or leave us a comment on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook. Thank you so much again for listening, and catch you on the next one.